Well, I've put a little wipe of molybdenum paste into these holes in the body, and we'll put that, drop that shaft into place, put its spring into place, and holding the spring down firmly with my thumbnail there, I'll pick up this little clip, put it on from the back, and snap, it's in position. Normally I rotate that so that the open face is towards the front, because then it's less likely to catch on the release, the film release button. Okay, so that one's in. The other one, release lever, drops in the other hole here in the body, and likewise I've already lubricated that with some molybdenum paste. You have to be very, very careful not to bugger this spring up while you're trying to get this lined up in place, because if it gets tucked behind the arm it gets bent. If it's hanging over the top of the body when you're trying to get it in line, it'll get bent. In fact, it'll get bent whatever you do really. It's a bugger of a spring to get in there straight and undamaged. A spring for that. Is this one, which is a heavier spring than the one that was on the lock lever, and a longer spring. Let's see if I can get this screw started. That's good. It went without a fight. That's always slightly suspicious. Okay, check that spring's tucked in okay. Run that screw down a little bit more. That's probably enough to start with. Okay, so that's our lock and release levers back in the body. The film advance shaft. Well, this was very, very sticky. Do I see any obvious difference between this and what I would expect to see on a Retina IIIC camera? No. It looks normal enough to me. There's nothing catching my attention there. And I want 3 nickel plated screws to hold that in position. And all of these nickel plated screws are nice and clean, because all the degreasing and the washing and so forth has removed all traces of adhesive from the ones that were holding the bottom plate on. Our film take-up spool, which is plastic. And it has a metal bush that goes into the base of that. Now that take-up spool, I normally give that a wipe out with naphtha, and I do this lightly and quickly. And I just want to remove any old grease from on the inside of that. The metal bush goes in the base. Now this is unusually, that's a press fit. Now that's something odd. Normally it's loose, and it doesn't make any difference that it's tight, but normally it's loose. It's loose enough to be a nuisance when you're trying to put it back in place because it falls out of position. So we'll just drop this spool into place in the body. And I need to lubricate this, and I use graphite grease on the bush and the spring in here, because I like the way the graphite grease works. It's quite tenacious, it sticks to the surfaces, and it's got a good feel to it. And normally I use the synthetic grease around here, because the synthetic grease is thinner and lighter, and it allows that ratchet pull to drop in across those surfaces without any problems. If I was using a thicker grease there, it just probably wouldn't run as smoothly. So, better find that. To carry on now, I need to lubricate this shaft on the film advance shaft here. Normally I use graphite grease for doing this job. I like the way this particular grease clings to the surface and has a good feel to the way it works. It's quite a high friction area there because of that spring, the way the spring winds up. It means it winds up on that shaft, and particularly at the top there you often get a groove cut into the brass shaft just from the action of that spring winding and unwinding over time. That feels good. I'll take some synthetic grease, run it round these little ratchet teeth, top and bottom. That's ready to go in. First I've got to check to make sure that the spring is correctly seated in that groove. And that everything else appears lined up okay. And slide that in here. Yeah, normally I flip the lock lever back out of the way, and the release lever need to guide that into position so that the spring doesn't get damaged. That's it. I can feel that that's passed into the bush on the bottom of the take-up spool. Now I've dropped the lock lever back in position so that the shaft is held in the right orientation there. And there are 3 small screws. These are nickel plated screws, same size as are used to hold the base trim on, and same size as is used to hold the top cover in place, but of course the top cover screws are chrome plated, not nickel plated. It's not always immediately easy to see the difference between nickel plated and chrome plated. You need to have your eyes open. There's a slight colour difference between the two. In some lights it's much easier to pick than in other lights. Get those 3 screws started. Once they're down, you can tighten them up. That's the shaft in place. And what I need to do now is lubricate and assemble this clutch assembly. And the clutch assembly's job, of course, is to provide some controlled slippage between the take-up spool and the sprocket. And if you didn't have some slippage there, then you'd end up stripping out film chips. You'd be creating film chips. Film chips being the little pieces of film between the sprocket holes on 35mm film. Alright, so this is a bit of an act getting this done. I've got a pair of crimp lug pliers here which are quite good for this particular task. I'm holding that in so that the lug's engaged. Now it's popped out. Start again. You have to be a bit cautious here because you don't want to distort the spring, which you will do if you crunch up on it too hard. I think that's just popped out again. This one's out to try my patience. The spring looks very subtly wrong, though presumably it was just old stock. Yeah, that's good. So the clutch certainly moves smoother in one direction than the other, but fortunately for us, the smooth direction is the correct direction. Yeah, taking a little bit of synthetic grease, I'll just run that around the inside of that clutch assembly, drop that into place on top of the take-up spool, rotate that until it engages with the notches in the top of the take-up spool. Which it ain't doing. Here we go. That's that in position. This, come on video camera, keep up. Yeah, this little piece here, this is the bush from the top of the film advance shaft. It has a little gear set on it, and of course this has been through the degreaser and the cleaner, so it's completely devoid of any lubricant. So I'm just forcing a bit of grease into that, and a quick wipe around the centre where it runs over the shaft, and drop that into place. If I roll the film spool backwards and forwards with my thumb, it will fall into place neatly. 2 screws hold this in position. The shoulder screw, which also supports the shutter cocking rack, that looks like it's a little bit less than straight. We'll have to review that. And on the opposite side we have the pawl, the ratchet pawl. It sits on top of a little bush. That bush has got a countersink on one side and it's plain on the other. It should be plain side up. And the screw, I normally give that a wipe with synthetic grease right on the top where the pawl runs round that shoulder. Run that screw in. If you had that small bush upside down, what it would happen is that the screw would run down into the countersink as you tighten it up and effectively lock that pawl and stop it moving correctly. So the bush must be plain side up, countersink side down. I'll fit the screw and the spring in place there at the top. Oh, of course this spring was a little bit out of shape, so I think I'll take the opportunity to true that up. Yeah, it's most definitely not correctly shaped. That's better. It's got a sweep in the other direction too. I'll see if I can get that a bit better. Otherwise the spring won't lie correctly and it may fall out of place. That should do. Sure you didn't see an awful lot of that happening, but there was work going on there, just nudging things. I'll fit this spring in position on the top here. Come on video camera, keep up. That spring should seat around that shoulder on the screw head. It's reluctant. It's going to slacken that screw off. I wonder whether that's actually... Yeah, there's insufficient clearance around that screw head to get that spring on there. That's better. That's good. Now I'm deliberately not tightening these two screws up here at the moment, because on the Retina IIICs, 3 big Cs, there must have been a change in the way they did their machining, and often there's very little clearance between this gear here and the shaft for the sprocket. So you need to have a bit of, allow as much clearance as possible simply by making sure these screws are loose before you get that shaft in place. Now I'll just seat my camera there. I've got that sitting on that tripod socket surround directly underneath the film advance here, just to support the shaft so the shaft doesn't drop down into the camera. Otherwise it has a habit of doing that. And then you've got to pull it back up into line again. Right, so a little bit of synthetic grease around the inside of this gear here, in the centre and underneath the edges is sufficient. And if I rotate that anti-clockwise as I put it down onto the shaft, it should engage with the gears and that pull and drop into place, which it does. Normally just set that facing straight ahead. This leaf spring arrangement here, I usually wipe some synthetic grease on that, not because it needs to be lubricated in order to work, but because it's a high carbon steel and it is prone to corrosion, and a nice sealing of grease there will prevent that from happening. Now this little pawl piece here, it's got some subtle damage on that corner. It looks like a manufacturing defect to me, to tell the truth. It's like it's been double punched. Really don't like the look of that. I'll see if I can find a replacement in my parts. Well, fortunately I was able to find one. It's an exact match. The right screwdriver would help. Because these cameras were assembled from spare parts some 17 years after the camera ceased production, there's every likelihood that some of the parts that they were assembled from were bottom of the barrel parts. Parts that had been pulled out and then tossed over to one side for one reason or another, because they weren't exactly perfect but weren't good enough to throw away. So So I think there may be an element of that. It's quite possible that some parts in these cameras will be imperfect because all the good parts had long since been used up or sent out as spares. So far so good. What's the next piece I need to do? Oh, at the bottom of the camera. Okay. Right, I want my block of wood, my all-purpose block of wood. So the catch that holds the rewind button locked in place once you've set it, I'm just putting a wipe of molybdenum paste over the tip of that and slide that in place. And this spring here, someone's bent the tip of that. I don't think that'll cause us any problem. I've seen that sort of thing done before in repairs, and it's where someone has decided that the spring would work better if it was a slightly different shape. Got that out of the way. That's better. Just had my lever trapped in under there and I wanted it free. So I've got to get that spring hooked around the back of that lever now, which is only medium entertaining. That lever across, lift that spring up and hook it into place. That's good. That's as it should be. Check that that screw is done up tight and that that lever still moves freely. It does. Excellent. So the film sprocket can go in. The slot goes upwards. There's a slot on one face. That goes upwards. The shaft, normally I lubricate the top 6mm or so, 1/4 inch, with a bit of synthetic grease. A wipe on the teeth of the gear doesn't hurt, and slide that in from the top. That's going in smoothly. If I'd done these two screws up tight earlier, that almost certainly would not go in smoothly. Get this lined up with the hole at the bottom. Pull that lever back out of the way, and I'm just pushing on that gear with my finger here to lift it up in position. So that's all good. The screw that drives the sprocket from the sprocket shaft has to go in at the top here. It runs in that slot. I'm just lining up the hole in the shaft there at the moment. And there is the screw. See if I can get it to stand in the hole while I find the right screwdriver. No, it's not lined up with the hole. You can see why, it's just rotated. Get that up where I can see it. That screw is really reluctant to start. I could rotate that shaft 180 degrees. It may be that the thread on this side of the shaft is not got a good lead in. Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah, look at that, straight in. Right, snip that screw up, that's done. So the rewind button to go on the base of the camera. So I put a wipe of synthetic grease into the spring for the rewind button, put that over the button, put the washer in place, and holding my finger on the top of the shaft at the top of the camera, put that, screw that button in, wiggle it backwards and forwards to make sure that it's actually passing the lever okay. That appears to be good. And I can tighten that button up. Now I've got a pair of pliers here modified to do that job. You don't need to overdo it. Usually I just put my thumb against the sprocket or my finger and tighten up against that. And if it starts to be uncomfortable, then you certainly got it tight enough. Let's just swing this shaft into position. Where are we? Our start position, before I start tensioning it, will be right there. We'll leave that for a second. Let's have a look at what we've got. Actually, everything revolves smoothly. It certainly appears to. That's good. This back door there's something odd about this. It's got a twist in it or something. It tends to hit the body casting right there. It hasn't got a twist this way. Just apply a bit of body English to that. That's a bit better. Okay. The film advance is pretty well assembled at the top there. At the base of the camera, I can tension the film advance, put the base plate on, put the film advance lever on, and then start working at the top of the camera. So I'll just pull that lever out of the way, rewind this one full turn, drop that back in place, make sure the lock lever drops back in place. That'll hold everything firmly. Now I've already got a wipe of grease around that surface there, so that's quite good. Just pop a little bit on the tip of that lock lever. And our chrome trim for the base of the camera can go on here now. This is held in place with nickel plated screws. In this case, because everything's been through the cleaner, they look nice and clean. Normally they would be quite obvious because they would have a good deal of glue and other scraps of leatherette stuck to them. Now I'm keen to get the film advance lever fitted here as quickly as I can, because I'm always in danger that I'll knock the lock lever from the top of the camera which will allow everything to unwind, and then I'll have to come back in to retension the film advance. No one wants to do everything twice. These screw heads are just not especially good fit with these countersunk holes. They look like the right screws, but the heads do not disappear into that plate as well as I would normally expect them to. So perhaps the plate hadn't been countersunk to the same extent. I think that's it. I think the problem lies with the plate rather than the screws. I think that it's not countersunk far enough. Right, our film advance lever is here, and I just need to clean this quickly and put that in place.